The message never reached her. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 65-year-old Margaret Ellis stared at her phone, watching the tiny loading symbol spin before the screen finally displayed "Message not delivered." She frowned, convinced her internet connection had failed again. Technology had never been her strongest skill, and she blamed the Wi-Fi more often than not. She tried again, the same result. Confused, Margaret opened another app. She searched for her daughter-in-law's profile. Nothing appeared. She checked Facebook. Gone. Instagram. Gone. Even the family group chat she had quietly followed for years had disappeared without explanation. A knot formed in her stomach. It wasn't her phone. She had been blocked. The realization settled over her like a heavy blanket. For several long minutes, she simply sat at her kitchen table, staring at the cold coffee beside her. Outside, birds chirped in the backyard, completely unaware that her world had just shifted. She picked up her phone again and called her son, Daniel. It rang 4 times before reaching voicemail. She didn't leave a message. Instead, she placed the phone face down on the table and let silence fill the room. Her eyes wandered toward an old framed photograph sitting on the counter. It showed Daniel at 10 years old, proudly holding the biggest pumpkin he had ever carved. His father stood beside him with an arm around his shoulders, both of them laughing so hard that neither had noticed Margaret taking the picture. Her husband, Richard, had been gone for nearly 12 years. Some mornings she still expected to hear his footsteps coming down the hallway. Life had become much quieter after his passing. Margaret had spent 32 years working as an elementary school librarian in Knoxville, Tennessee. She loved books because they reminded her that every difficult chapter eventually gave way to another. When she retired, she imagined traveling, volunteering, planting flowers, and finally spending time on herself. Instead, most of her attention remained focused on Daniel. He was her only child. After Richard died, mother and son had leaned on each other through grief. Somewhere along the way, helping Daniel became second nature. She never questioned it. Mothers weren't supposed to keep score. Daniel had always been hardworking. He earned a business degree, found a promising position with a regional shipping company, and built a comfortable life. Margaret couldn't have been prouder. Then he met Claire Morgan. Claire was confident, intelligent, and ambitious. She worked in digital advertising and seemed to have endless energy. During their first dinner together, Margaret welcomed her warmly, asking about her career, her parents, and her hobbies. Claire smiled often, complimented Margaret's cooking, and even insisted on helping wash the dishes afterward. Margaret believed her son had chosen well. When Daniel proposed 2 years later, she happily contributed several $1,000s toward the wedding reception. She never viewed it as an expense. It was an investment in their happiness. The wedding was beautiful. Richard's absence hurt deeply, but seeing Daniel begin a new chapter filled Margaret with hope. The first year of their marriage seemed peaceful. Margaret visited only after calling first. She respected their privacy and never wanted to become the overbearing mother-in-law people joked about. She had her own routine. Every Thursday, she volunteered at the local library. Friday afternoons belonged to coffee with her lifelong friend, Helen. Weekends were spent tending roses, tomatoes, and herbs in the backyard she had carefully cultivated over decades. Life felt balanced. Then everything changed. Daniel called one rainy afternoon with news that his department had been eliminated during company restructuring. He tried to sound calm. He failed. Margaret recognized the fear in his voice immediately. "You'll find something," she assured him. "You're talented, Daniel. This won't last forever." "I hope you're right," he replied quietly. 2 weeks later, he asked whether she could help cover one mortgage payment while he searched for work. Without hesitation, Margaret transferred the money. She didn't ask for repayment. She didn't expect gratitude. She simply wanted her son to breathe a little easier. Claire texted later that evening, "Thank you, Margaret. We really appreciate your help." Margaret smiled when she read it. She even saved the message. She had no idea it would become one of the last kind texts Claire would ever send her. 1 month of assistance quietly became another, then another. Each request sounded temporary: a mortgage payment, a car repair, groceries after an unexpected expense, the veterinarian bill when their golden retriever needed emergency treatment. Each time Margaret told herself the same thing: families help each other. She never imagined those small acts of generosity were slowly becoming an expectation instead of a gift. And she certainly never imagined they would eventually cost her far more than money. By the end of autumn, Daniel had picked up a few consulting jobs, but they weren't enough to replace his old salary. Some months he earned a respectable amount. Other months there was barely enough to keep up with the bills. Margaret understood uncertainty. Life had taught her that even responsible people could stumble when circumstances changed. That belief kept her saying yes. Whenever Daniel called, she listened patiently before quietly transferring whatever amount he needed. Sometimes it was for the mortgage. Other times it was utility bills, groceries, or insurance payments. She never demanded explanations because she trusted her son. Months passed before she noticed a pattern. Daniel almost never called simply to chat anymore. Their conversations began warmly enough. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" "I'm doing well. How about you?" After 2 or 3 minutes, the conversation always drifted toward money. "There's just one problem. We're a little short. Could you help us this month?" Margaret never complained. After hanging up, she always convinced herself things would improve soon. Meanwhile, Claire announced she had resigned from her marketing position. According to Daniel, she was exhausted and wanted time to figure out what she truly wanted to do. Margaret sympathized. Mental health mattered. Everyone deserved a chance to recover from burnout. Still, she couldn't ignore the quiet question forming in the back of her mind. If neither of them had a steady income, how long could this arrangement continue? She kept those thoughts to herself. Christmas arrived. Margaret invited Daniel and Claire for dinner. They accepted, though Claire spent much of the evening checking her phone. Daniel seemed distracted, constantly discussing interviews and freelance projects. Margaret tried to keep the atmosphere cheerful. She served Richard's favorite roast recipe, baked homemade pies, and even wrapped several thoughtful gifts. For a few hours, everything almost felt normal. Almost. After dinner, Daniel lingered while Claire carried dishes into the kitchen. "Mom," his voice carried the familiar hesitation she had begun recognizing. "The landlord is increasing our rent next month." Margaret waited. "We're short about $200 every month now." She looked at him carefully. "What are you asking?" "I was hoping. Maybe you could cover the difference until I land something permanent." Margaret didn't answer immediately. That evening, after they left, she opened her banking app. For the first time, she added everything together: mortgage assistance, car repairs, veterinary expenses, insurance, groceries, emergency transfers, holiday expenses, wedding contribution. She checked the numbers twice because she thought she'd made a mistake. She hadn't. During the previous year alone, she had spent nearly $25,000 supporting Daniel and Claire. Margaret leaned back in her chair. The amount wasn't enough to ruin her financially. Her pension remained secure. She had savings. But seeing the total written on the screen changed something inside her, not because of the money. Because she suddenly realized she couldn't remember the last time either of them had asked how she was doing before asking for help. The next afternoon, Helen stopped by for coffee. Margaret almost never discussed family problems. But this time she quietly slid the notebook across the table. Helen studied the figures silently. Finally, she looked up. "Margaret, did they know how much you've given?" "I don't think so." "Do you?" Margaret hesitated. "I didn't until yesterday." Helen reached across the table and gently squeezed her friend's hand. Helping someone through a crisis is kindness. She paused. Keeping them from facing reality isn't. Those words lingered in Margaret's mind for days. She wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly she felt tired. Tired of pretending every request was temporary. Tired of convincing herself that next month would finally be different. In early March, Daniel called again. His tone sounded hopeful. "Good news. I've got several interviews lined up." Margaret smiled. "That's wonderful. But there it was again. The rent increase starts next week. He explained that they needed another monthly contribution, only $200. It doesn't sound like much, Daniel said, but it would really help. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. She loved her son more than anything. That hadn't changed. But something inside her finally whispered a truth she could no longer ignore. If she continued solving every financial problem, Daniel would never be forced to solve one himself. She took a slow breath. Daniel? Yes? I can't keep doing this. Silence. I've helped because I wanted to, she continued gently, but I think it's time for you and Claire to figure out another solution. More silence, then his voice became flat. So, that's it? It isn't about love. It feels like it. No, Margaret answered softly. It's about believing you're capable. Daniel ended the conversation less than a minute later. The following afternoon, Claire sent Margaret a message unlike any she had received before. It accused her of abandoning family during difficult times. It suggested she cared more about protecting her savings than helping the people she supposedly loved. Margaret read every word. Then she quietly placed her phone on the kitchen table. She typed several responses, deleted every one of them. Some arguments cannot be won because the other person has already decided the ending. 2 days later, Margaret discovered Claire had blocked her on every platform. Daniel never called to explain. The silence between them had officially begun. For the next 6 weeks, Margaret resisted the urge to pick up the phone. Every morning she glanced at Daniel's contact in her phone, wondering whether she should call first. Each day she decided against it. If he wanted to talk, he knew where to find her. Life outside the silence continued. She watered the flowers in her backyard. She volunteered every Thursday at the library, helping children discover books they were excited to read. Friday afternoons were still reserved for coffee with Helen, who never pushed Margaret to discuss family matters unless she brought them up herself. Little by little, Margaret noticed something unexpected. Her days felt lighter. The constant anxiety of waiting for the next financial emergency slowly disappeared. She no longer checked her phone every time it buzzed with the fear that another request was waiting on the other side. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think about her own future. One Monday morning, she scheduled an appointment with her longtime attorney, David Reynolds. He had handled Richard's estate after his passing and had always spoken to Margaret with patience and respect. After exchanging greetings, he asked a simple question. "What brings you in today?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I think it's time I started planning the rest of my life." For nearly 2 hours they reviewed everything: her savings, her retirement income, her investments, her will. David listened carefully as Margaret explained the financial help she had given Daniel over the past year. When she finished, he folded his hands. "Margaret," he said gently, "you've spent decades building financial security." She nodded. "You deserve to enjoy it." Those words struck her harder than she expected. Enjoy it. She couldn't remember the last time she'd thought about what she actually wanted. David pointed to another document. "There's something else. What is it?" "This house." Margaret looked around his office thoughtfully. She had lived in the same 3-bedroom home for over 30 years. Every room carried memories. Richard painting the nursery before Daniel was born, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, graduation photographs. But now, 3 bedrooms, 1 person, a large yard that required endless maintenance. She quietly admitted something she'd been afraid to say aloud. "It's too much house." David smiled. "Then maybe it's time to find something that fits the life you're living now." The idea stayed with her all week. By Saturday, she contacted a local real estate agent. Within days, professional photographs had been taken. A for sale sign appeared in the front yard. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as strangers walked through the house, admiring hardwood floors, spacious bedrooms, and the beautiful garden Richard had once helped plant. Instead of sadness, she felt peace. She wasn't leaving memories behind. She was carrying them with her. Nearly 2 months after Claire blocked her, Margaret's phone finally rang. Daniel, her heart skipped. She answered immediately. "Hello." His voice sounded exhausted. "Mom, can we talk?" "Of course." He hesitated before continuing. "We're in trouble." Margaret listened quietly. Claire's freelance work had slowed. His consulting contracts had nearly disappeared. They had fallen behind on rent. The landlord had given them one final deadline before beginning eviction proceedings. "We need $5,400, Daniel admitted. "If we can pay it this week, we'll be okay." Margaret closed her eyes. Months earlier, she would have opened her banking app before the conversation even ended. This time was different. She had spent weeks thinking about this exact moment. Not with anger, not with resentment, with clarity. She spoke slowly. "I'm not going to be able to do that." Silence. Then Daniel whispered, "You're really going to let us lose our apartment?" His words pierced her heart. Every instinct inside her wanted to rescue him, to promise everything would be fine, to solve the problem the way mothers often do. Instead, she remembered Helen's words. Keeping someone from facing reality isn't kindness. Margaret took another steady breath. "I love you more than you'll ever know. I don't feel it. I know it probably doesn't feel that way today. So that's it?" "No." She kept her voice calm. "I believe you're capable of finding a solution. You don't understand." "I think I do." Another long silence settled between them. Finally, she continued. "For more than a year, every difficult situation has ended with me writing a check. Maybe that's kept you from seeing just how strong you really are." Daniel didn't answer. "I'll always listen if you need someone to talk to," she said softly. "I'll always be your mother, but I can't keep solving financial problems that belong to you and Claire." A few seconds later, the line went dead. Daniel had hung up. Margaret slowly placed the phone back on the table. Her hands trembled. Tears filled her eyes, not because she regretted what she'd said, because loving someone enough to stop rescuing them hurt more than she had ever imagined. That evening, she sat alone on her back porch, watching the sunset spread across the Tennessee sky. For the first time in months, she whispered something Richard used to say whenever life became difficult. "Doing the right thing isn't always the easiest thing." She smiled through her tears. This time, she finally understood exactly what he meant. Margaret barely slept that night. She replayed every word of her conversation with Daniel, wondering if she could have said something differently. Perhaps she could have softened her tone or found gentler words. But no matter how many times she revisited the moment, the answer remained the same. She had told him the truth. And sometimes the truth sounded harsh simply because people weren't ready to hear it. The following week, life continued moving forward. The realtor called with encouraging news. "We've received 3 offers," she said. Margaret smiled. "Already? The market is strong. I think you'll be very pleased." After reviewing each proposal carefully, she accepted one that exceeded her asking price. The closing was scheduled for the beginning of June. As she walked through each room preparing for the move, memories greeted her everywhere. Daniel's height marks were still penciled inside the hallway closet. Richard's old workbench remained in the garage, exactly where he had left it years before. The backyard garden, once filled with family barbecues and birthday celebrations, now stood peacefully beneath the warm spring sunshine. Margaret paused beside the kitchen window. This house had witnessed almost every important chapter of her life. Falling in love, marriage, motherhood, loss, hope. She quietly thanked it for carrying so many memories before turning away with a peaceful heart. A few weeks later, she moved into a comfortable 2-bedroom condominium across town. It wasn't large. It didn't need to be. The building overlooked a quiet park where children played every afternoon, and her balcony received just enough sunlight for flower pots and vegetable planters. Within days, bright red geraniums lined the railing beside 2 containers of tomatoes and fresh basil. For the first time in years, Margaret arranged her home exactly as she wanted. No spare bedroom waiting for guests who rarely visited. No oversized dining room that stayed empty most of the year. Everything felt manageable. Everything felt peaceful. Nearly a month passed without hearing from Daniel. Margaret never reached out. She kept the promise she had silently made to herself. If their relationship was going to heal, both sides would have to walk toward each other. Then one Saturday afternoon, Helen arrived carrying sandwiches and iced tea. The two friends sat on the balcony watching families stroll through the park. "You seem different," Helen observed. Margaret smiled. "In a good way?" "In the best way." Margaret laughed softly. "I finally realized something." "What?" "I spent years believing love meant fixing every problem." Helen nodded. "And now?" "Now I think love sometimes means trusting people enough to solve their own." Helen raised her glass. "That's wisdom." Margaret gently tapped her own glass against it. "Maybe it's just experience." Meanwhile, through a mutual family friend, Margaret occasionally heard small updates about Daniel and Claire. They had left the expensive apartment before the eviction process was completed. Instead of borrowing more money, they rented a much smaller place on the edge of town. Claire accepted a full-time marketing position with a growing company. Daniel continued interviewing, while taking temporary consulting assignments whenever possible. For the first time in over a year, they were living entirely on their own income. Margaret felt relieved. Not because they were struggling, because they were finally standing on their own feet. She never celebrated being right. She simply hoped they would eventually recognize their own strength. Late one afternoon in July, Margaret checked her mailbox after returning from the grocery store. Among advertisements and utility bills sat a plain white envelope. Her name had been written by hand. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Daniel. Her hands trembled slightly as she carried the letter inside. She made herself a cup of tea before carefully opening the envelope. Several pages rested inside. Not printed, handwritten. She began reading slowly. "Mom, I've started this letter at least 10 times because I wasn't sure how to say everything that needed saying." Margaret continued reading through tears. Daniel admitted that somewhere along the way he had stopped appreciating her generosity. What had once felt like an incredible gift had gradually become something he expected. He confessed that every time she rescued them, he convinced himself they needed just one more month, then another, then another. He also revealed something Margaret never expected. He had started seeing a therapist. During one session, the counselor asked him a simple question. "If your mother disappeared tomorrow, how would you solve your problems?" Daniel admitted. He had no answer. That realization shook him. The therapist encouraged him to rebuild his confidence instead of depending on someone else to rescue him. For the first time, Daniel saw the situation from his mother's perspective. Near the end of the letter, one sentence made Margaret stop reading for a moment. "You weren't abandoning me when you said no. You were finally treating me like the man I should have been acting like all along." Tears rolled quietly down her cheeks. Not tears of victory, tears of relief. She folded the letter carefully and held it against her heart. Months of silence had finally given both of them something endless conversations never could: perspective. Margaret placed Daniel's letter inside the top drawer of her desk, beside the last birthday card Richard had ever given her. She didn't answer immediately, not because she was angry, not because she wanted to make Daniel wait. She simply believed some words deserved careful thought before they were returned. For several days, she reread the letter every morning with her coffee. Each time she noticed something new. Not in Daniel's handwriting, but in herself. The hurt she had carried for months no longer felt as heavy. It hadn't disappeared. It had simply lost its power. One quiet afternoon, Margaret sat at her dining table with a sheet of stationery and her favorite fountain pen. She began writing. "Dear Daniel, thank you for your letter. It means more to me than I can put into words." She paused, choosing each sentence carefully. "Being your mother has always been the greatest privilege of my life. Nothing that happened over the past year has changed how deeply I love you. But love doesn't always look like saying yes. Sometimes it looks like believing someone is strong enough to stand on their own, even when they don't believe it themselves." She told him how proud she was that he had asked for professional help instead of pretending everything was fine. She praised him for accepting responsibility instead of making excuses. Most importantly, She reassured him that the door to her life had never been closed. It had simply needed healthier boundaries. At the end of the letter, she wrote one final sentence. "Whenever you're ready, you're welcome to come over for coffee. No expectations, no discussions about money. Just mother and son." She sealed the envelope and mailed it the next morning. 3 days later, her phone rang Daniel, this time when she answered. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, he whispered, "Hi, Mom." Margaret smiled. "Hello, sweetheart. I got your letter. I'm glad. I've missed you." Those 4 words carried more honesty than any apology could have. "I've missed you too," Margaret admitted. Their conversation lasted nearly an hour. They talked about ordinary things, the tomatoes growing on her balcony, a neighbor's energetic puppy, the new mystery novel Margaret had just finished. Daniel shared that he had accepted a full-time management position with a transportation company. The salary wasn't as high as his previous job, but it offered stability, and for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful about the future. Claire had remained at her new marketing position as well. Together, they had created a strict budget, paid off several overdue bills, and even started a small emergency savings account. "It isn't much," Daniel said with a laugh, "but it's ours." Margaret couldn't have been happier. Several weeks later, Daniel asked if he could visit. When Saturday arrived, Margaret baked his favorite apple pie, just as she had done since he was a little boy. The knock on the door came precisely at 2 o'clock. When she opened it, Daniel stood there holding a bouquet of fresh sunflowers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Daniel stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his mother. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Margaret hugged him tightly. "I know." They stood there quietly, letting months of pain melt away without needing another explanation. Later that afternoon, they sat on the balcony, drinking iced tea while looking over the small park below. The conversation flowed naturally, not perfectly. Some wounds still needed time, but honesty had replaced resentment. That was enough. A few days later, Margaret received an unexpected phone call. It was Claire. Her voice sounded nervous. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight," Claire began. "I just wanted to tell you that I handled things badly." Margaret listened without interrupting. Claire admitted she had allowed stress, fear, and pride to cloud her judgment. Blocking Margaret had been immature, and she regretted letting anger control her actions. Margaret accepted the apology without pretending everything was instantly repaired. Trust, she knew, returned slowly. Like a garden after winter, it needed patience, care, and time. As summer faded into autumn, Margaret settled comfortably into her new life. Her balcony overflowed with flowers, herbs, and ripe tomatoes. Thursday afternoons were still spent at the library, helping children discover the joy of reading. Friday coffees with Helen remained a cherished tradition filled with laughter. Daniel visited every few weeks. Sometimes Claire joined him. Sometimes she didn't. There was no pressure anymore. Their relationship grew naturally instead of being held together by financial dependence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret looked around her peaceful condominium. It wasn't the largest home she had ever owned. It wasn't the fanciest. But it was filled with something far more valuable: peace. She finally understood a lesson that had taken more than 6 decades to learn. Real generosity isn't measured by how much money you give away. It's measured by whether your kindness helps someone become stronger rather than more dependent. Looking back, Margaret never regretted helping her son. She regretted waiting so long to set healthy boundaries. The money she had spent was gone forever. But the lesson it taught remained priceless. Life had given her another beginning instead of an ending. She had learned that protecting her peace wasn't selfish. Choosing herself wasn't abandonment, and saying no at the right time had ultimately become the most loving gift she could have given both her son and herself.